Welcome to The Roll Forward, a podcast for the next wave of finance leaders, especially those looking to transform their roles by making smarter, faster, and more profitable business decisions using the power of technology and a forward-looking approach to finance. Listen in to learn how to get out of the back office trenches and become a more strategic partner within your organization.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Roll Forward podcast. My name is Joe Michalowski, and this episode is brought to you by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. And today, my guest is Taylor Davidson, founder of Foresight, a company that offers a big library of financial model templates for entrepreneurs. Taylor, thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So before we get into main topic, which, if you offer a library of financial models, it should be no surprise that we're going to talk about financial modeling. Would love to get the quick background on you, what your job history is, and how you ended up starting Foresight.
Sure. So I've been building models for companies for nearly 25 years now. Kind of started in private equity and then worked at startups and business school, did a lot of other things. Worked in venture capital for 5 years. I've run Foresight full time for the past 5 years. And basically Foresight's, what I think is like a boutique, like product and services, a company where I build actual kind of products for models for people to kind of use and download and deploy for the businesses. And then I also provide help and support people kind of adjusting it for what they need.
Cool. Well, I think, we talked a little bit about this right ahead of time. It's that, we've had a lot of like operational finance people on in the past, but financial modeling is such a big topic for everyone we have on, obviously, and just really excited to get your perspective because you've been doing this so long and how you see things going for the people you work with. So there are all kinds of industries and verticals available on Foresight, but we're going to focus on SaaS because that is what we focus on in this app or in this podcast, and would love to set the stage by just talking about what the target audience is for your SaaS financial model template that's available on Foresight.
So the majority of entrepreneurs that I work with are typically people who have started a company, typically working with founders, typically companies that haven't really made their first finance hire or more have a more junior hire. Typically like the CFO role is, don't have a great, even typically a part-time CFO, typically like one of the executives or head of ops or some other roles kind of fulfilling that kind of core function. They don't really have like a finance team capabilities kind of built out yet. So that typically follows from like pre-seed through seed rounds up into A rounds as they're kind of making that transition to bring people on.
Gotcha. I don't know what the Foresight library looked like. Maybe this was like one of the first models you built. I know there are a lot of them on there now, but what was kind of the impetus for making this template? What were pain points you were hearing from entrepreneurs? Like why'd you decide to offer this? And what do you think the value is that people get from it when they download?
So I started building financial models for friends, for companies, doing consulting services back in like 2004, 2005 era. And I did a bunch of like consulting projects, building models, all custom models for people. And at a certain point, I got tired of doing that basically. And I kept doing the same thing repeatedly over and over. And a friend of mine said, "Hey, can you help me on my company?" And he was kind of going through Accelerator. And I said, yeah. And you know what? I'll use this as an experience to create a productizable approach towards building a model that can be a broader kind of share. And use that experience to go then and use the past experiences, that specific experience of this company to build like a template and kind of first release that as like a downloadable thing, like 2008, 2009 here, I guess. And then started evolving, kind of building on top of that into releasing into actually charging for it. And then building up more kind of verticalized approaches or generalized approaches towards doing models kind of thereafter. And so, for me, it's always been about building models as a way to provide some kind of structure towards kind of thinking about understanding the business. Like for me, a model is not, this is not, the future. It is an analytical tool to think about the future. And so the pain points is basically about like understanding kind of what structure to use, how to think about all these different kind of components. It's really easy to get caught in the mess of like all these different things that people talk about in terms of metrics and those things. And it can be hard to kind of boil it down to the things that matter for certain stages of your business. And so the goal has been always provide like clarity around that and provide some standardized structure or repeatable kind of processes to kind of build models around that you can, leverage without having to kind of learn everything on your own.
I think that's such an important point. I've talked to, a handful of finance leaders, and in one instance had the VP of finance from Fivetran, Taylor Lewis, on the podcast and talked to him for an article for the website. And I remember he was talking about being the first finance hire at Fivetran and kind of coming in and not having that structure that you're talking about. So I love this idea of using the financial model as kind of like the structural backbone of, all of the metrics and the things that you need to look at in the business. But I'm curious, like, when you're talking to these entrepreneurs, like, is there a set of people who don't really see the value in a financial model? Like, it's really easy when you and I are talking about it and we're saying like, yeah, put it in and like you have this structure. But I guess I'm trying to think of the other side of the coin where it's people that are running their business without one. Like, what do you run into without, something as early as possible? What are some of the problems you would have?
So there's a couple of areas there. So like, first off, like think of what the core use of the model usually is, right? So usually the model is built for like actually kind of a plan and operate and manage the business. And the other one is also probably used to like communicate something externally in terms of like a fundraising process. So lots of times people don't know models unless somebody else asks them to. Like in general, in general, we don't do hard work unless someone else forces us to do so. And so oftentimes you don't build like an actual kind of model kind of for business because you're too busy running the business. You're too busy dealing with the operational stuff, managing cash, doing all those sort of stuff. And so it's not until like you have to actually kind of forecast the future of the business and tell a story and create some financials that backs up the narrative of your growth. Usually convince somebody else of what the future of the business is, like an investor. And so that's often like the point at which somebody says, okay, fine, I need to create an extra kind of forecast against that. It's common to be running a company and not even have like a budget for the next 6 months and 12 months. And it makes sense. And part of the point is like a model encompasses a wide variety of things, right? Yep. So the way I like to think about it is the components that are necessary, that are valuable for different stages, right? C stage company, early stage, creating expense budget is always important. You should always have a budget to be able to manage your expenses and be able to lay out a strategy in terms of how you're going to spend your money, right? First, because one, you have to manage cash, but also two, it's like who you're going to hire, who you're going to bring on board, where you spend money on. It's an indication of your strategy as well. And you're actually thinking about like how you're doing this business. And so that's an important thing for every stage. Now, forecasting revenues depends on stage, right? I see just it as much of a fault as in terms of a company not forecasting revenues, not having a model, is actually having too much of a model doesn't fit the stage of your business. It's really easy to build something really complex that does all those sorts of things that doesn't actually like reflect kind of where where the company's at. You don't need a really detailed, complicated, forecast or revenue forecast and modeling out churn and all this kind of growth channels. If you don't have a business yet, right? If you don't actually have it, or if you're not you're leveraging kind of all those kind of levers that are kind of that SaaS business, you don't need that. So what I like to say is like early stages, focus on the things that kind of matter that are under your control. And then as your business evolves, build more kind of complexity, detail into your model to the degree to which you can use the model to help you make business decisions. And the decisions themselves that matter are going to vary at different stages, right? So that's the thing I like to kind of true back to is how do you use the model to like accomplish something that you have to do with your business.
I think that's great. I love this idea of like, the model is kind of like a living, breathing thing. Like it's going to keep evolving like as the business continues to evolve. And, totally with you. I think it's true in any job function. Like the simpler you can keep things for as long as possible, the better off you're probably going to be.
But often not done, right? So my point is, oftentimes we build a model and then we got to go away from it. We never kind of go back to it at all. And so oftentimes it's just because it's too hard, right? Like it's too hard to actually update and manage it. We may build a model as like a one-off kind of forecast the future, but we don't build in all the structures necessary to kind of use it as a living document going forward. And so we don't use it. We don't actually kind of like use it as a tool of business. So, there's ways to address that as well. But, lots of times we don't use it as a kind of tool to kind of like really kind of manage the business going forward, but it's important to kind of think like that.
Yeah. I mean, well, it's why, people are lucky that people like you are out there. It's why people are lucky to have, any software tools that they have available. So love all of this. And I think, we're going to dig into kind of the building blocks, like the real nitty gritty of kind of the balance there of simplicity versus like adding complexity over time. But before I get to that, I want to do like one more sort of preliminary setting the stage kind of question, which is comparing like a SaaS financial model to some of the other industries that you have. I know you have a background in e-commerce. So how does the complexity or the process of SaaS financial modeling compare to some of the other early stage models that you deal with on a daily basis?
Well, Okay, one, there's a lot more levers in SaaS, right? And there's a lot more, I think, in general, like knowledge about SaaS business online. There's a lot more complexity that people kind of know to kind of build into it. So a lot of levers. The other one is often comes down to how we think about modeling out like retention, churn, and those aspects is often like one kind of core difference between a lot of different businesses. The other thing about SaaS kind of comes up is there's a whole set of like alternative like metrics around it, right? How you think about billings, deferred revenue, revenue recognition, revenues that side can be very different from other businesses. And there's more kind of inherent complexities in terms of like understanding those components, revenues and cash that aren't necessarily applicable like a lot of other business models. And the other part is the thinking about the business around MRR and ARR, right? Is an additional level of like management level metrics that are kind of valuable to think about the business that aren't really applicable or don't have that same kind of degree of extra kind of management metrics on top of the business that you find for other kind of business models. I think those are kind of the major things. But billings, in terms of like actual kind of model stuff, billings, revenues, cash, churn, those things are the kind of most, things that are most different between SaaS and other models.
Gotcha. Makes a ton of sense. I think this kind of answers that question. So fine if there isn't another one, but what I wanted to ask, if you're like an entrepreneur changing from like an e-commerce industry to starting your first SaaS business, is there anything else other than what you just listed as like what to expect to change if you were running that kind of model? You're used to e-commerce models versus a SaaS model. I think to your point, it's a lot of retention, a lot of like the things that come in with a subscription business. But I wanted to give you the stage if there was anything else that stands out as kind of differentiators there.
I mean, a lot of the ways that we use the data and pull data is the same, right? You can still do cohort-based stuff. You can still look at subscribers and customers the same way, repeat and new. You can still use a lot of that.
Nice.
But the way you have to understand the metrics is going to be different because the idea of like churn is kind of like fundamentally kind of different underlying it. So you have to think about how you kind of build the metrics up a little bit differently. But those are the 4 ones.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, we've been talking for a little bit and I wanted to make sure that there was a meaty part of this conversation that, before we got to it, that we got to talk about really where we are in terms of like a Foresight customer, which would be like that early stage entrepreneur versus, maybe that really mature or increasingly mature SaaS company. But now that we've kind of set that stage, we know where we're at. I want to dig into the actual model because I try to make these episodes like as tactical as I can. Like it's hard to learn like anything just on audio. So like, this isn't really like a guide to building your own SaaS financial model, but as much as we can, I would love to do that. So I'm just going to leave this question being very simple, although it'll probably be like the meatiest question I have. Sure. It's just to you, as someone who builds models all day, what are the core building blocks of that early stage SaaS financial model? What are the absolute essentials and how do you go about putting it together?
So I try to build a model for SaaS that maps back to the levers that are important in terms of understanding the growth of the business, right? Yep. And so growth of the business, from SaaS, the specific comes around acquire new customers and then retain them, right? So the kind of core building blocks that I tend to kind of focus on is acquisition, conversion, retention, churn, and revenues and billings, right? As like 5 kind of distinct entities. They capture like acquisition in terms of like how you actually grow, the channels used for growth, conversion is how you use those channels to convert to customers, retention and churn. I think of like, we're just inverse of each other, but maps out how you often get people to kind of return. Then you have revenues and recognize revenues from that. Then you have billings, which is like the cash, the billings and cash associated with that. The SaaS specifically, you really do have to pay attention to, the difference between like revenues and the contract cycles that are embedded in kind of retention curves, which may be different from the billing cycle. I'm modeling out the billings and handling the difference between when you actually receive cash, when you actually kind of recognize the revenue associated with it. So those are like the core like 5 building blocks that I kind of focus on in terms of building a model. Now, the degree of complexity you may get in each one of those may vary depending on what you're doing. And there's a variety of approaches to it, right? Like going down from like acquisition kind of on down, you can model acquisition as like overall just growth. Like how do I acquire kind of new customers, right? And you can go even deeper into modeling out different kind of channels. The more complexity you have in the business, the more understanding you have in terms of a multi-channel approach, the more metrics and data you have about that, you can get more detailed acquisition from social or search or SEO, paid media or those sort of things, breaking down organic and paid and CAC, all those sort of things.
Yep.
And so you can expand acquisition to as many kind of different channels and acquisition metrics as it be. The next layer of top is like conversion. It says, okay, so you have this like top of the funnel approaches all across different channels. How do you convert them into new subscribers? Now, conversion is one of those things where there's like simple ways to do it. Say, hey, I have a certain level of like top level funnel and a certain percentage of them convert to become customers. Or in a B2B SaaS setting, I have leads and I'm growing from a sales force that's growing number of leads and I'm taking them through an actual kind of conversion flow to like new subscribers from that. Now, you can also get more detailed around building out lags from first touch to conversion. You can build in multi-touch lags where, a certain cohort of like new leads or new touch, kind of a 1 month, kind of a percentage that kind of comes in over time. You can have multi-seat licensed enterprise SaaS style companies where you sign an initial agreement and then kind of grows the number of seats over time. So there's a variety of ways to do the model conversion.
Yep.
Simple, but also, much more like detailed in terms of like, lags and kind of cohort base.
Sure.
So all that's going to feed into then your acquisition of like new customers. And then you build out a normal building block, subscriber building block, which is, subscribers beginning of period, new, churned, renewed, subscribers kind of end of period. So like the kind of core block to understand the change to subscriber base over time. Churning as well as you could do it very simply. You could just say, hey, a certain percentage of customers churn over time. In SaaS specifically, there's a great value to doing cohort-based churn, right? It's meaning you're going to vary the churn over time as a function of how long a person's been a subscriber. It's going to vary very differently, but based on the type of business. In typical enterprise SaaS, it's probably 12 or cycles of churn, which, cohort-based approach is going to be a little less important. But especially for, SMB style SaaS or mid-market SaaS, being able to break down the churn on a cohort basis of like new subscribers added per period is like a really very important thing. And then the reason for that is it's very common to model churn as, hey, you got to churn off a bunch of people early on. And then the later a person is a subscriber, the longer the person's subscriber, the less likely they are to churn. So you create that kind of churn curve. It's not this way. And it's especially in businesses that have, distinctly different churn as a customer kind of ages. It's important to kind of break out that kind of churn retention curve into, monthly cohorts to be able to model the mechanics appropriately as a kind of model out kind of a growth of the company as well. And the good thing is we have so many tools nowadays to actually measure this. We have so many cohort-based tools that we kind of pull data from that allows us to kind of look at all the cohort performance. And there's such a great, I'd say, language and understanding around how to understand historical cohorts, but we can use those historical cohort performance and forecasted performance as well to forecast out the existing performance from those cohorts over time, then also forecast the performance of the future cohorts as well. So there's a lot of detail we can get into creating a cohort-based forecast around that for SaaS if that's kind of guide for the business. The next two components, revenues and billings, kind of goes into the thinking of how do I recognize the revenues from subscribers, how do I charge for them, and then billings is how do I actually kind of receive cash from them. The most, the nuances to think around this is around that I always have to think about in terms of modeling is how detailed do I have to get in terms of breaking out the components of my subscribers, right? So it's really easy to say, right, we cover subscribers before, so it's like all subscribers, but do I need to break that up? Do I have significant difference in my subscriber base? They're going to have significantly different performance metrics over time. Can I assume just an average revenue across all subscriber tiers, or do I need to assume some substantially different churn or retention metrics associated with them? Is it valuable for me to break out the subscriber bases into multiple subscriber blocks that map back to different acquisition channels? Because I want to think about their growth uniquely. I want to grow one. Maybe I want to grow one subscriber base very differently than other ones. Especially if you have small, medium, large style businesses, at a fundamental level, you could just assume averages across that. But once you start changing the mix of customers over time, then you have to kind of break all this thing out into the different subscriber codes. The additional kind of caveat thing about revenues is, are the revenues changing over time? So oftentimes we say, hey, somebody signs up for they sign for a subscription and they pay that amount over time. That's totally fine. Maybe the renewal price or subscription is different. Maybe they have more of a land and expand strategy where you're signing at some rate and then growing that kind of time, right? I'm sorry, growing the kind of revenue from that customer as a function of our customer, modeling out the underlying their business as well. And so like, when you do that, you have to, do more kind of cohort-based approaches to kind of capture like that those kind of mechanics as part of it. But, oftentimes when we're building a lot of models, we don't have to, we can just assume kind of averages as well. The only other additional layer on top of that is modeling out billings. And typically with billings, we have to model out the billings cycle kind of separately from the contract cycle so that we can model out the churn on a contract basis separately from modeling out when the actual billings come. Is it an annual contract that's billed annually? Is it an annual contract billed monthly? Is it an annual contract that's billed quarterly? There's a lot of like different ways to kind of approach that. And the more that we get away from a pure 1 month contract, 1 month billing cycle, the more important it is to kind of model out the differences associated with that.
Man, I feel like I could tackle a whole Excel spreadsheet on my own, which is not something that I ever do. The thing that I want to follow up with is not all amazing. I feel like I got a masterclass in like what goes into putting a financial model together, but I think at every turn, there's this way to do it. There's a different way to do it. There's multiple ways to do it, which I think, is the point. It needs to adhere to what the business model is. Before we kind of keep going down that path, I wonder, like, how do you even build a blank template that you can offer to like a broad variety of people? Like, how do you offer something to someone that isn't just, I don't know, entirely built for one of these instances that they can actually iterate on? Like, what's that process for you?
That's a good question. Like, I don't know if that's something I've kind of continued to evolve my own perspective on over time. All the models themselves, I kind of rebuilt everything effectively here like 6 months or so as I kind of learn from like actually utilizing it with people, like how to actually kind of change the approaches in there. Ultimately, so like the most important thing, and when someone asks, hey, how do I use the model to do this? The first question I always ask is like, what do you want to do? Like, what is your business and what is your goal? And I'm always trying to understand is what are the major things that you're trying to use this model for in your business? And then once we identify the goal in terms of how it's going to be used, then we can think about the level of complexity that's necessary as part of it. Because I have multiple models for SaaS that do SaaS in different ways. Some in simple. And I speaking back to kind of the earlier point is I have models that do SaaS in fairly simple ways. I also have models that do SaaS in very detailed and complex cohort-based ways. Building out a tool that applies across all different situations is never an easy thing to do. And I don't think it's ever possible to make something that's perfectly usable across every different business model. And also, like, people have different approaches in terms of how they want to do things, in terms of how they want to think about how to break out their business, how they want to break out the subscriber sets, how they want to grow, all those sort of things. So there's no one kind of way to do it. Yep. In general, in terms of building models, what I try to do is build on like layers of like progressive complexity. And what that means is I try to make the inputs fairly simple, like the first level inputs fairly simple, hide a lot of like the complexity in terms of calculations in an actual like calculation sheet, and then present the output in a separate sheet. So the separation between inputs, calculation, and presentation. For a lot of people, what I want them to do is use the inputs and look at the presentation and not really dig into the calculation part, because to pre-build a template that works across a wide variety of models means I have to build fairly complex calculation kind of level things. And I don't want to force someone to try to understand the calculation as part of that. I want to focus on inputs and outputs. And then, but I do build in a lot of additional layer of inputs into the calculation layer if someone needs to make those modifications towards it. So like, for example, most of the SaaS models I build, I have an assumption for like average revenue, right? Cool. You could build in weighted average tiers for different subscriber tools, all sorts of things. But one of the core things then the next question, when the next input is going to be, okay, does the revenue change over time? Right? I'm just going to leave it. And I usually express that as like a simple like growth percentage, right? Yep. Now, what that does is that then creates a forecast of average revenue going forward over time. Yep. Now, under the hood, what I do in that set of calculations is I have actually another set of inputs that forecast out that growth and cut of revenues over time using one method. But built to the core model is like 20 different methods, right? So you can then go and select a different method for the growth. You don't have to assume like a standard percentage change over time. You can do a logarithmic change, or you can create your own curve, right? You can directly input your own curve. And then you can apply those kind of differently, right? So instead of just saying it's average revenue that applies across all cohorts, you can say, no, I want to have this start at a certain, like whenever a subscriber starts, and then have that change be a lag effect over time. Meaning each new subscriber starts to the same number and then grows over time, which means average revenue is applied across all. Now, I don't want to force someone to deal with that level of complexity, a level of inputs, because they're not going to know how to handle it.
Right.
And so what I try to do is keep simple base level inputs at the base level of input level, but then provide additional layers of input complexity into the calculations if it's necessary or if someone can kind of utilize in that way.
It's a really cool approach to making this as flexible as possible. Like I wasn't really sure where. I haven't seen the model myself, and honestly, I don't work in this business, so even if I did see it, I'm not sure I would get that nuance on my own anyway. So really cool how you build the flexibility in there. So yeah, I was just curious how the template building process actually goes.
Well, and my goal is for someone to not even care about that, right?
Yeah.
Like I want someone to not have to necessarily understand all the complexities as part of it. Because there's a certain bit of it where I don't want to force someone to understand the calculations part of it. Now, the side is, as an entrepreneur, you probably do need to understand the business, right? You have to understand the business. You have to understand how the model calculates that.
Yep.
And the way I say that is like the degree to which you're going to do that is depending upon your understanding of finance. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs, they don't have that yet, right? Yep. So what they have to understand is like, do I understand my inputs? Do I understand my outputs? Do I understand the basic mechanics? And then as they kind of get more understanding of finance, or as they work with people degree of understanding of finance, they can dig more into the complexities and expose them to other things to think about. I think it's really easy to get lost in complexity. I think it's really hard to make something that's like simple. And so I try to start simple first and then build on the complexity as someone can take advantage of it.
Yeah. I mean, to that point about like what the finance knowledge is of the audience, like I think one, it speaks to your understanding of who you're building these models for. So like that's great. It makes a ton of sense. But I'm curious, like for this, group of people, these entrepreneurs that have varying degrees of finance knowledge themselves, like you listed out the 5 building blocks, like that's great. I could hear the like massive complexity or like variance in complexity between them. But I'm curious, like which aspects of the model in your mind or in your experience give your audience the most trouble? Like which are the most flexible pieces? Where do they have to spend the most time trying to customize or working with you to figure out all those different levers that you were trying to explain before?
That's a good question. I think structurally, one of the hardest things to deal with is dealing with differences in subscriber base.
Yep.
So can we assume an average customer, or do we have to break out the calcs into like separate customer sets? And what's the right set of customer sets to use, right? That's kind of like the core thing that kind of impacts a lot of complexity in the model. The other thing I would say comes into the acquisition side, meaning, in most of the models I actually take a fairly vanilla approach to forecasting our acquisition channels. I basically say paid organic, right? I don't get a lot of detail in detailing. Hey, here's all the different organic channels. Here's all the different paid channels. And I find that as people as they use it more for planning purposes, then they'll want to break out the acquisition side into more channels and utilize the acquisition metrics most applicable for each one of those businesses, and even model out different conversion ratios for that. So those are kind of the core things that are kind of important or find the most kind of scope for kind of changes over time.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. I think I can think about, the way I work in marketing here. And so I can think about the go-to-market spreadsheets that we have that break out, the different organic channels. Like I work in content, I own different organic channels. And so can think about the conversion rates that we expect for, something like a webinar channel versus like our search traffic or something like that. So, really interesting to hear that.
The one thing I'll add to that is the other component to that is that it's not just the channels, but it's like where they go.
Yeah.
Meaning that the way that you would want to forecast the growth for a, consumer or SMB type SaaS business is going to be very different from how you want to do it for an enterprise style business, right? Yep. One of which you're going to have your normal growth channels, from paid organic. Enterprise, where you're probably tied much more to a, salesperson, sales cycle, SQL type approach for it.
Yes.
And so the more detailed you have to get in terms of breaking those components out, the more like valuable it is to have different structures towards it, all the way down from everyone's kind of the same to every customer is uniquely different, their own kind of customer. There's like a wide kind of range there. And it's not uncommon for a business to have both of those models embedded in the business, right? Where you have, hey, here's the SaaS, here's the normal rates we charge, then there's enterprise call us. And call us means there's a variety in terms of like how to price that. And so we as kind of modelers have to think like, how do we handle that? How do we handle like the variation? Can we assume there's an average, or do we just need to uniquely model each individual kind of customer differently? So
I think this leads nicely into kind of the next question I want to ask, which is like, you've addressed how you build flexibility into these templates. We've talked about kind of the massive variance in like how you can approach these things and all the different levers there are. And so I want to talk a little bit about the limitations of a template-based approach, because I know that you are very specifically focused on the early stage, the entrepreneurs that are like have nothing in place or have something like very basic in place and trying to elevate that. But what's the like breaking point where your customers typically move on to building their own operational model or upgrading from the template-based approach to something new?
Yeah. So that's a good question. There's a couple of different ways to take that. One is I view all templates as a mixture of like an execution and education.
Yep.
And even inspiration for that degree. Right. And so, for some people who don't have the capacity to kind of build on a model or kind of understand the mechanics of it, because building a model embeds a number of different kind of skill sets. Do I know how to use the tool, right? Spreadsheets, whether it's Excel or Google Sheets or whatever. Do I understand finance or accounting to be able to know the kind of terminologies and structure in terms of how to understand revenues that are presented in a standard accounting format? Do I understand how to do business modeling in general, right? And so can I break out the components of the business from an operational sense outside of just a pure accounting finance perspective? So, can I use the tool? Do I understand how to model the business? And then can I present those results in a way that makes sense to like an accountant perspective? So those are kind of core like skill sets embedded within there. For a lot of relationship entrepreneurs, they don't have that, right? They need an actual tool which delivers that thing for them. And it's very easy to build a template which is not flexible enough for a wide variety of cases for that. And, but they're also, but as you get more advanced in terms of understanding the tools, then templates can become more of an educational tool to look at and understand, hey, here's one way to approach it that worked for this person, but I want to do it differently, right? Or I want to build my own model so I can completely understand it. And I'm going to use this as an educational tool. And for me, that's great. Like, I am not a proponent of like, you have to use a tool as is. My thing is like, my goal is to provide a structure for someone to understand how to do something, whether they choose to use my stuff straight as is, or whether they choose to build their own, learning from it. Like if they're able to learn about how to build a model from it, that's a win for me, right? That's the way I do it. Now, as you build out spreadsheets in general, there are breaking points. And the interesting thing about this is like, years ago, there weren't a lot of extra tools available for people to use. Like you could, go into really heavy, complex things, but a lot of businesses were stuck inside kind of the spreadsheet paradigm. But I think there's a lot more avenues for people to build models these days that don't use spreadsheets to evolve past that point where they need to regularly update the model on a monthly basis and kind of pull accounting QuickBooks data. And there's ways to do that. There's ways to use third-party add-ins to pull in accounting data into spreadsheets. But it does require kind of, a very structured approach in terms of having the spreadsheet and then effectively like spreadsheet development ability to utilize those tools. Valuable if you want to do that, but there are limitations in terms of people that want to do that. And so that's where I think like when it comes down to like managing a business, kind of bringing in data kind of on a monthly basis, both the financials and the operational side, and kind of constantly utilizing it, that's where there becomes a lot more potential to move outside of a spreadsheet template and move towards more like a web app to kind of build and understand your models.
These are all really great points. I think the kind of summary of like the themes that you were talking about is just, there's so much flexibility in this. It comes down to the time and the understanding that you have of like how to actually build this out, and everything that you're saying about, taking the time to use this as an educational tool. Really cool. It's not something that I have experienced in the past. It's not something I spend a lot of time in myself. So I really like the way you put that. I had a couple more questions about this like limitations of financial model template track, but I think we've answered them because they were mostly around like, what are the the challenging components that you wouldn't be able to use a template for, or kind of like it's not worth trying to force a template or the flexible sort of starting point to do what you need it to do versus just building your own. So I guess like instead of rehashing some of what we've said, I'm curious if has there ever been someone that you've tried? I know you offer consulting alongside these templates. Like, has there ever been someone that comes in and they're like, I need to change these pieces of the model, and you're like, hey, maybe like there's a better solution for you versus like spending all of this time updating this starting point? Like what does that look like in conversation?
Oh, definitely. And so, going back to kind of a point I said earlier, whenever somebody asks me a question, what to do to model, my first question back is, what's the goal? What do you want to accomplish?
Yep.
And so, if I ask that question and I hear, hey, here's the stage I'm at, here's the thing that you accomplish, here's what I want to do, oftentimes I'll hear like, that's cool. You probably shouldn't do this in Excel, right?
Yeah.
Your business is probably past that point, or maybe there's other things for you to kind of evaluate or look at, or, what you're looking to do is different enough from what you're looking to how the model does it, that you should have a different approach to it. Now, and that's an important point that I don't think I kind of fully brought out about how I kind of approach and think about templates and how I often kind of work with kind of people around this is the way I approach building a template is a very kind of modular based system for it, meaning that I separate out, there's aspects of templates which are roughly the same for all the different types of businesses. And there's aspects that are wildly different. Now, expense forecasting, financial statements, budget variances, handling actual financial summaries, charts, reports, those sort of things are fairly similar across a wide variety of businesses. Obviously, some metrics and charts are going to vary to being a business model, but the core structure you use for it is very similar. And you can build I approach building a model so that I have this kind of core base, which works for almost any type of business. And I have like a pre-built kind of revenue model that's built into it, which can be widely applicable for a wide variety of businesses. However, that revenue model itself is effectively a component of the overall model. And I try to build a model so that swapping out a revenue model or building a custom revenue streams or scrapping it using a completely different approach to it, I try to approach that so it's easy. Oftentimes someone will come to me with a model they've already built and they're already using. They'll say, hey, I want to adopt your model. Oftentimes I'll say, you don't. Like this model actually works. This is a model that someone else has built. I've seen it before. I understand how to use this. This is good. Like this model that either you're using someone else's template or you're using like a model you built yourself. Like you've thought about the mechanics of the business that does a good job of that. Don't try and swap and try to rebuild to get to the same revenue numbers, a different approach. Let's just utilize the revenue structure we already have and do some additional, reporting or reporting structure on top of that. So I really try to build templates so that you can utilize any revenue model out there and easily link it into the model to change the reporting or the communication of the model, the kind of key results from it very easily. And so I bring up the backstory for that because oftentimes when people come to me is they'll say, hey, they'll explain bits about the revenue model and say, that's cool. The pre-built structure, you could use it for that, but either it'd be too complicated to accomplish it, or you can do this far simpler. And so oftentimes what we'll do there is we'll just strip out the existing kind of revenue model approach and build out a custom revenue model, which is unique for your business. And honestly, if you're going to spend time building custom models, that's the part that's most important. There's rebuilding a set of consolidated financial statements. I spent too many thousands of hours of my life balancing out balance sheets. Forcing someone to do that is not like a fun process for it. And that's not where the value comes in building a model. The value comes from, hey, how do I forecast out how the company's going to grow their revenues? And how do I think that way? That is the part that is unique to your business that utilizes the most, like thinking about what you're doing. And so I try to make the model if we're going to do a custom approach to it or we're going to do something different, I want to focus all our time on that part, which is specific for something that can help you actually think about kind of what.
This is really insightful. I love this. To me, all I hear is maintain flexibility, keep things as flexible as possible at all times, because, we wrote an article one time on our site about, the limitations of financial model templates, but in a lot of ways, it's like those, like you just search financial model template and you just grab like the first one you see on Google. And it's like, we talked about like the house of cards that becomes like your assumption. So you just build this like rigid model eventually that just has like, if you get one, little calculation wrong, or you have like one missed input, the whole thing breaks. And, everything I've learned from you today as we talk is just, I think, just reinforcing this idea that you want to keep things as simple as possible, as long as possible, and really just maintaining that flexibility so you don't end up in one of those situations. So yeah, just really insightful. It's great.
I mean, and it's hard to do that, right?
Yes.
Like with all of my models, like if you type an input in incorrectly, then things are going to break and you're going to understand what happened.
Yep.
What I try to do is communicate as much as possible through notes and things to express back to say, here's how you should use it, and here's how to think about it, and create built-in checks and those sort of things. It says, hey, this number looks off. You need to go look at something. Now, most models in general are built by a person for the thing they need to accomplish. They're not built as a productized tool for other people to use for their business. And so they don't build in all this sort of things that are outside the scope of like what they have to do. And so most templates are, they can be used for what they're doing as long as what you're doing fits that specific thing as long as the specific thing the person was modeling fits the specific thing you're doing, right? The more that it varies, the harder it is to kind of build that. And it's hard to build a productized tool for that. The more that they become educational tools to kind of understand that. And so most templates, I'll say this differently. There's a common kind of refrain out there that says, don't use a template, build your own model. And I don't disagree with that, right? Even as a person who builds multiple templates for lots of people, I don't disagree with that. What I try to focus on is pick the parts of the template that's most useful for you to really, really understand and build that. If you fundamental base, if you want to, build your unique revenue model that specific for your business, go for it. Do it.
Yep.
But don't rebuild everything, all the charts, reports, and those sort of things. If you can leverage something that can easily adapt for what you're kind of looking to do.
Yeah, I mean, especially for your audience, that early stage entrepreneur, they're scrambling to do, 27 different jobs trying to get this business off the ground, and, rebuilding an entire model that you could, the components that you can definitely steal and templatize is probably not high on the list of things that they need to be doing. So yeah, totally understand that. I think it's a really great point.
I mean, models we haven't reached the stage in terms of models where we can deliver components that we can with like websites, for example. Right? Yep. I mean, think of like the broader, like software in general has become much more like component based. We can pull in libraries and tools and frameworks and things, and we kind of leverage them and pull different components of code that are pre-built that we kind of pull into our app or our site we're building, so we don't have to rewrite those things. That's the whole component. That's how software kind of works.
Yes.
Excel, it's hard to do. It's hard to do for a lot of reasons. It's hard to do because basically all the code is exposed, and everybody uses a spreadsheet to kind of do that. It has to be like has to think like a software engineer to do that. And that's not going to happen. People aren't going to be software engineers to build that. But I think if you try to like think of like a component based approach towards it, then you're able to get something that's a lot more valuable for people, quicker, easier, and cheaper. So,
yeah, love it. We've been talking a bit. I got two last questions for you. One is, I liked in the very beginning of this, and I wanted to get to it eventually, but you had mentioned kind of the process for getting this to market and actually like iterating, and how many different versions have come out and how you look at it like every 6 months or something to that effect. And I'm curious if there's one thing you remember or that stands out as something that you changed or learned as you were bringing these templates to market. Is there something that you learned about SaaS financial modeling that you built into your product to make it better?
That's a really good question. So I continually learn from people's reactions or questions about how to use the model for what they're doing.
Yep.
And I utilize that as a learning experience to change the feature, the functionalities that are in there, so then apply it to everybody else.
Yep.
I think the core thing that I've kind of evolved over time has been, specifically for SaaS, is more flexibility around subscriber builds and around retention, and then more reporting, more SaaS specific reporting. Because I know like in the first one, I think the first like SaaS model I have, mechanically it created the numbers, but it didn't have the same SaaS specific reporting that people and investors and insurers would want. So, and then it spends some time thinking, okay, what metrics do we need? Do we really need to come out with? Are there specific charts or views or metrics that need to be kind of built out, pre-built to do that? So I think the major things that I've gotten better on over time is that management level reporting around SaaS, MRR, ARR, and all the components of that.
Yep.
But then also some of those subscriber ability, MRR movements, kind of those things, which are important for a SaaS entrepreneur to understand the business, which I would say the earliest versions of models to kind of did approach.
Gotcha. Makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's a callback to everything we talked about, that subscriber build, the return or retention and churn being those like really flexible, challenging components. I think it makes a lot of sense that those are the ones that stand out as ones that you've had to kind of learn how to build as you keep bringing this to market. So love all that. I want to leave you one last question, something we ask everybody that comes on. But it's a simple one. It's really going to zoom out. We spend a lot of time in the weeds of financial modeling, which is great. I'm curious if there's one thing that you know now that maybe you wish you knew at the start of your career, at the start of this whole financial modeling journey that you've been on for so long.
I would say, don't give up.
Mm.
Meaning, I've been building models and tools, inside companies or outside for, 25 years now.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot along the way. And I also learned there's a lot of parts of it that are hard. Building models and building kind of complicated financial things that are used by tons of people in ways that you had thought of and ways you hadn't thought of, it can be hard. And you're going to hear lots of things, about you have to, I would say you have to have a fairly thick skin in terms of how you approach things to put out the core guts of what you do for everybody to look at. And so you're always going to hear feedback about, hey, you should change this. This is the best way to do that. And finding a way to listen to the parts of it that allow you to grow without getting frustrated or pushed back, of being able to kind of continue to do this is kind of like the most kind of important kind of lesson for me in terms of, knowing what to listen to and knowing what to learn from and knowing when to kind of push back as well. And the balance between that is really hard. And that's why I always true back to continue to learn, continue to listen, continue to learn and continue to learn it at such level that you can then educate it kind of back to people. And that just takes a long time to be able to do that.
I think that's such a great answer to tie it back to, some of the other people I've spoken to. Whenever I ask this question, it's funny because you and I have talked about Excel and modeling this whole time, but anytime I ask like a finance leader, a CFO or a VP of finance, what they wish they knew, it's never about, I wish my Excel skills were better. I wish my knowledge of like my financial models was better earlier on. It's always something about relationship building or partnering with the business. So to your point about, the challenge of like putting your work out in front of people and kind of like being able to listen and things like that. That's what it sounds like to me. All these finance leaders want to be known for in the business is their ability to partner with other departments. So it's not just building a financial model in the background to build it. It's taking that financial model and actually like helping the business. To your point, what are you trying to do with this model? What are your objectives? What are your goals? So, you and I talked about, some of the other people that have been on and your background being different as someone strictly modeling. I think you fit right in as far as this question goes. It's like something that's really in line with what everyone I've talked to cares about. So I really love that answer. It's a good one.
Everything I've always heard from finance leaders is the degree to which they have to learn to kind of partner and build relationships across the organization so that they can, help them use the thing they do to other parts of the business in a really valuable way.
Yep.
And so, I think there is a degree to which you have to think about like, hey, how do I use this sort of thing to help people in their businesses? And
yeah,
could kind of continue to kind of evolve on that.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, we've been talking for a while. I want to be respectful of your time. We could probably dig into your brain about financial modeling for hours and hours. I know you got a lot of knowledge up there. So just want to say, really appreciate you coming on. I think what I'll leave it at real quick is just giving you the stage. Where can people go to connect with you, to learn more about the work that you're doing, to download these amazing templates that you've been talking about? The stage is yours.
Yeah. So pretty simple, easy to find. My company's called Foresight, FORESIGHT.is. You can also find me at TaylorDavidson.com. My email, my phone number is all on the websites. So those are the best places to contact me.
Cool. Well, Taylor, thank you again for all the time. Thank you for dropping so much knowledge about financial modeling. I feel like this is a true masterclass for someone like me who, it's a new concept for me for sure. So yeah, just want to say I really appreciate it and I hope we can chat again in the future.
Cool. Would love to.
All right. Thanks, Taylor. Talk to you soon.
Cheers.
Thank you for checking out this episode of The Roll Forward. This show is powered by Mosaic, a strategic finance platform that transforms the way business gets done. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow The Roll Forward wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Or visit mosaic.tech/podcast to get immediate access to all of the latest episodes.